The airstrikes are over. Maduro is in New York. The press conferences have moved on to the next story. But the Venezuela crisis hasn't ended. It's metastasizing. What started as a military operation in Caracas is now a naval standoff in the North Atlantic. It's a border security crisis in Colombia. It's a diplomatic fracture across Latin America. And it's becoming something nobody in Washington seems to have planned for: a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia over a single oil tanker. 3 days ago, a Venezuelan-linked tanker fleeing U.S. forces in the Caribbean painted a Russian flag on its hull, changed its name from Bella 1 to Marinera, and re-registered under Russian authority. Now that ship is 230 miles off the coast of Ireland, and Russia has sent a submarine and naval vessels to escort it. This is what escalation looks like. Not dramatic, not immediate, just a slow accumulation of tensions that transforms a regional operation into something far more dangerous. Today, I'm going to walk you through what's happening right now. Not what happened last week in Venezuela, but what's unfolding this week across the Atlantic, along the Colombian border, and inside diplomatic meetings where countries are choosing sides. Because this isn't about Maduro anymore. This is about oil sanctions enforcement, maritime law, regional sovereignty, and whether the international system can contain conflicts or whether conflicts will shatter what's left of that system. Let me show you what's actually happening. The blockade that isn't working. On December 16th, President Trump announced what he called a total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers traveling to and from Venezuela. He posted on Truth Social that Venezuela was completely surrounded by the largest armada ever assembled in the history of South America. The language was dramatic, the execution less so. According to multiple tracking services, tankertrackers.com, Windward Maritime AI, and analysis from Bloomberg and the New York Times, at least 16 oil tankers have successfully evaded the blockade since Maduro's capture on January 3rd. 16. That's not a handful. That's a coordinated exodus. These ships carried approximately 4 million barrels of crude oil and fuel that definitely left Venezuelan waters. Another 12 vessels carrying an estimated 8 million additional barrels were tracked leaving Venezuelan ports in what appears to have been a wholesale, synchronized departure. Samir Madani, co-founder of tankertrackers.com, said the timing was striking. All 16 vessels rushed to leave immediately after Maduro was captured. They happened straight after the Maduro operation and could only have been pulled off if they were done in a wholesale, coordinated manner. So what we're watching is not a functioning blockade. What we're watching is a game of maritime hide and seek, where the hiders are actually quite good at hiding. These are what intelligence agencies call dark fleet tankers, vessels that operate outside normal maritime regulations. They turn off their automatic identification system transponders, which are supposed to broadcast location and speed to prevent collisions, or they spoof their locations, falsifying their AIS signals to make it appear they're somewhere else entirely, sometimes oceans away. According to Reuters, the global dark fleet consists of more than 1,400 tankers. Over 920 of them are under sanctions from the United States, Britain, or the European Union. But here's the problem. Only 40% of the dark fleet ships serving Venezuela are actually under U.S. sanctions. That means 60% of them, hundreds of vessels, fall outside the scope of Trump's blockade order. So when the administration says they're enforcing a complete blockade, what they're really saying is they're trying to intercept a subset of ships that are specifically designed to avoid detection. The U.S. has successfully seized two tankers, the Skipper in mid-December and the Centuries in late December. Both seizures involved Coast Guard maritime security and response teams, Marine Corps Special Operations personnel, and helicopters launched from aircraft carriers. But two seizures out of potentially dozens of attempts, that's not a blockade. That's a disruption. And the difference matters because Venezuela's oil exports are the lifeblood of its economy. Oil accounts for nearly 90% of the country's export revenues. If the blockade were actually working, if tankers couldn't leave, Venezuela's economy would collapse within weeks. Storage facilities would fill up. Production would shut down. The government would lose its primary source of funding. But that's not happening. Production has slowed, yes. Some tankers are stuck in port, but oil is still moving. Revenue is still flowing. The system is adapting. Then there's the Marinera, the tanker that became a diplomatic crisis. The Marinera used to be called the Bella One. It's a very large crude carrier, a VLCC in shipping terminology. These are massive vessels. This one was previously registered in Panama. It was sanctioned by the Treasury Department in 2024 under President Biden for involvement in Iranian oil trading. In December, as U.S. forces tightened their pursuit, the ship's operators did something creative. They painted a Russian flag on the hull. They changed the ship's name to Marinera. They re-registered the vessel under Russian Maritime Authority. And then Russia made it official. Moscow recognized the ship as a Russian-flagged vessel operating under its protection. Now that's a problem, because seizing a ship flying a false flag, pretending to be from a country it's not registered in, that's one thing. Seizing a ship that's actually registered with a recognized state, that's a diplomatic incident. The Marinera was last tracked 230 miles off the coast of Ireland. U.S. Coast Guard vessels were in pursuit. U.S. Navy P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, the kind used for submarine hunting and long-range surveillance, were flying off the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. KC-135 aerial refueling tankers were in the area. C-130 transports, U-28 special operations aircraft. This wasn't casual monitoring. This was preparation for an interdiction operation. And then Russia sent a submarine and surface vessels to escort the tanker. Two U.S. officials confirmed this to CBS News. The Wall Street Journal reported it first. And suddenly, what was a law enforcement operation became something else entirely, because now you have U.S. military assets and Russian military assets converging on the same location, both sides operating under orders, both sides committed to objectives that are incompatible. The United States wants to seize the tanker. Russia is escorting it to prevent seizure. That's not a standoff. That's a confrontation with the potential to escalate very quickly if someone miscalculates. On Monday, President Trump was asked about the situation at a press conference in Mar-a-Lago. He said, "It's moving along and we'll end up getting it. Yeah, we're actually pursuing it. Can you imagine? It came from the wrong location. It came out of Venezuela, and it was sanctioned." But whether the U.S. actually seizes the Marinera now that Russian naval forces are involved, that's unclear. The administration hasn't said. Military operations can be shelved. Plans can change. And the Marinera might not be alone. According to the Russian Maritime Register of Shipping, at least 3 other sanctioned oil tankers operating near Venezuela have recently changed their flags to Russia. So what we're seeing is a new tactic: tankers evading U.S. sanctions by seeking Russian protection. And Russia, apparently, is willing to provide it. This creates a situation where every future interdiction attempt could involve Russian forces, where every seizure could become a diplomatic crisis, where the U.S. blockade, already struggling to enforce compliance, now faces a geopolitical complication that makes enforcement significantly harder. Colombia mobilizes on the border. While the tanker drama plays out in the Atlantic, another crisis is building on land. Colombian President Gustavo Petro mobilized security forces along the 2,219-kilometer border with Venezuela. He deployed additional troops. He activated emergency protocols, and he made a statement that got attention across the region. Petro said an attack on Venezuela is an attack on Latin America. He condemned the U.S. strikes, and he warned that Colombia would not tolerate spillover from instability next door. Now, Colombia is a U.S. ally. It receives significant military aid. It cooperates on drug enforcement. It's been one of Washington's most reliable partners in the hemisphere. But Petro, a former leftist guerrilla, has always been ideologically distinct from previous Colombian leaders. He's criticized U.S. policy before. He's called for rethinking the war on drugs. He's pushed for regional solutions to regional problems. And now he's positioning Colombia as a defender of Venezuelan sovereignty, not Maduro's government necessarily, but Venezuela's right to exist without foreign military intervention. This matters because Colombia shares more than a border with Venezuela. It shares communities. Families live on both sides. Trade flows both ways. Refugees, millions of them, have crossed into Colombia over the past decade, fleeing economic collapse. If Venezuela descends into chaos, if there's a power vacuum, if armed groups start operating more freely, Colombia absorbs the consequences: increased migration, cross-border violence, drug trafficking routes destabilizing. So Petro's mobilization isn't just symbolic, it's practical. He's preparing for scenarios where Venezuelan instability threatens Colombian security. And he's making clear that Colombia won't support military adventurism that makes those scenarios more likely. But there's another layer. By condemning the U.S. operation and positioning Colombia as a defender of sovereignty, Petro is also signaling to other Latin American countries. He's saying, we need to stand together. we need to make clear that unilateral military action in the hemisphere is unacceptable. And that message is resonating. Latin America's unified response. This is where the Venezuela crisis becomes something bigger, because the regional reaction isn't scattered, it's coordinated. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Spain, and Uruguay issued a joint statement, not individual condemnations, a joint statement. That's significant. That's 6 countries, some left-leaning, some centrist, one European, speaking with one voice, saying the same thing. This was a violation of sovereignty. This sets a dangerous precedent. This cannot be normalized. Brazilian President Lula da Silva went further. He said the U.S. strikes crossed, quote, an unacceptable line and called on the United Nations to act. He said attacking countries in flagrant violation of international law is, quote, the first step toward a world of violence, chaos, and instability. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum condemned the military action as a threat to regional stability. She emphasized that unilateral interventions jeopardize the entire hemisphere. And she did this while simultaneously working to maintain cooperation with Washington on other issues, border security, trade, migration. That's a delicate balance. Condemn the Venezuela operation, but don't rupture the broader relationship. It's diplomatic tightrope walking. Chile's government issued a statement emphasizing respect for international law and the UN Charter. Uruguay echoed similar concerns. Spain, a European voice, but one with deep historical and cultural ties to Latin America, said it does not recognize unilateral interventions that violate international law. This is a bloc response, and it reflects something that wasn't true a decade ago. Latin American countries are more willing to coordinate, more willing to push back against U.S. pressure, more willing to say, we have our own interests, and they don't always align with Washington's. Part of this is ideological. Several current governments lean left or center left. They're skeptical of U.S. military action. They remember past interventions, Guatemala, Chile, Nicaragua, Panama, and they see echoes of that history in Venezuela. But part of this is also practical. China is now the largest trading partner for most of South America. Chinese investment has built ports, roads, and energy infrastructure. Latin American countries have alternatives now. They're not as economically dependent on the United States as they once were. So when Washington acts unilaterally, when it ignores international institutions, when it uses military force without multilateral consensus, these countries can afford to object. They can afford to coordinate. They can afford to say, this is not acceptable. And that shift from individual complaints to coordinated regional pushback, that's a structural change. That's not something that goes away when the Venezuela crisis fades from the headlines. The UN Security Council emergency meeting on December 20th, the UN Security Council held an emergency session to discuss the Venezuela situation. Multiple countries raised concerns about maritime law and member sovereignty. Some countries, Panama and Argentina, supported the U.S. Others condemned it. China's representative stated that the U.S. action seriously violates international law and Venezuela's sovereignty and threatens peace and security in Latin America and the Caribbean. Russia called it lawlessness in the Caribbean Sea, where long-forgotten theft of other people's property, namely piracy and banditry, are being revived. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson called the tanker seizures acts of piracy with no legal basis under international law. Now, you can dismiss these statements as predictable. Russia, China, Iran, they're adversaries. Of course, they criticize U.S. actions. But the point isn't whether these countries have clean hands. The point is that the United States is losing the narrative battle. Even countries that have engaged in their own violations of international law, Russia in Ukraine, China's maritime claims in the South China Sea, can now point to Venezuela and say, see, the U.S. doesn't respect the rules either. This is the credibility problem. When the United States violates the principles it claims to defend, it undermines its ability to hold other countries accountable. And that matters, because international law only works if there's a shared sense that it applies to everyone. If it only constrains the weak while the powerful do as they please, it's not law. It's just the preferences of the powerful. The UN Secretary General issued a statement expressing deep alarm and warning that the Venezuela operation sets a dangerous precedent for international norms. He didn't say it was illegal. He didn't call for sanctions. He just expressed concern, because that's what the UN Secretary General does when a major power violates the Charter. He expresses concern and hopes someone listens. But the structural problem remains. The United States holds veto power at the Security Council. Any resolution condemning the action will be blocked. The International Court of Justice has no jurisdiction over the U.S. in this matter. The Organization of American States is divided and lacks enforcement power. So functionally, there are no consequences. The U.S. can conduct this operation, other countries can condemn it, and nothing changes, except perception, except trust, except the willingness of other countries to cooperate with Washington on future issues. Those things erode slowly, but once they're gone, rebuilding them takes decades. The economic dimension, oil markets and dark fleets. Let's talk about what this means economically, because the blockade, however imperfect, is having real effects. Venezuelan oil production has been disrupted, not stopped, but slowed. According to Windward Maritime AI, at least 16 tankers that arrived to load crude or discharge naphtha, a product used as a diluent to help export Venezuela's thick, heavy crude, are now sequestered in Venezuelan ports. Some vessels are being used as floating storage because they can't leave territorial waters without risking seizure. Venezuela's storage facilities are filling up, and when storage is full, production has to slow. You can't keep pumping oil if you have nowhere to put it. This creates economic pressure on the Venezuelan government. Less oil exported means less revenue. Less revenue means less ability to pay government salaries, maintain services, or buy political loyalty. But it's not crippling, not yet, because the dark fleet is still operating. Ships are still evading the blockade, and some buyers, primarily China, are still willing to purchase Venezuelan oil despite the risks. According to CEIC economic data, Venezuela exported more than 655,000 barrels per day in 2024. That's down significantly from peak production in the early 2000s, but it's still substantial. And while the blockade has disrupted some of that flow, it hasn't stopped it. The bigger question is, what happens if the U.S. escalates further? If Washington starts seizing ships in international waters more aggressively, if it pressures insurance companies to deny coverage for any vessel that goes near Venezuela, if it imposes secondary sanctions on banks that handle payments for Venezuelan oil, then the economic pressure increases dramatically. But each of those steps also increases the geopolitical cost. Seizing ships creates confrontations with Russia. Pressuring insurers disrupts global maritime commerce. Secondary sanctions alienate allies who don't want their banks cut off from dollar-based systems. This is the dilemma. The U.S. can tighten the blockade, but tightening the blockade means more confrontations, more diplomatic costs, and more incentive for other countries to build systems that don't depend on U.S. approval. Meanwhile, oil markets globally have remained relatively calm. Prices didn't spike. Why? Because Venezuela's current production, less than 1 million barrels per day, is small enough that its removal doesn't materially affect global supply. But the precedent matters. If the U.S. can blockade Venezuela, can it blockade other countries? Iran? Russia? What happens when sanctions enforcement becomes naval warfare in all but name? Those are questions traders and analysts are starting to ask, and the answers will shape energy markets for years. Unverified claims and information warfare. Now, I need to address something that's been circulating on social media. Videos claiming to show U.S. Marines or Coast Guard personnel boarding tankers. Footage of Black Hawk helicopters. Claims that multiple ships have been seized in dramatic operations. Some of this footage is real. The seizure of the skipper in mid-December was confirmed. Video from that operation was released by Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. But other claims, particularly those showing dramatic helicopter boardings or Marines storming ships, have not been independently verified by major news outlets. This is important to understand. In modern conflicts, information spreads faster than verification. Social media amplifies dramatic footage. People share videos without checking sources. And sometimes old footage from different operations gets relabeled and presented as current. I'm not saying these claims are false. I'm saying they're unverified. And in a situation like this, where tensions are high and multiple governments have competing interests, unverified information can be dangerous. It can escalate tensions. It can create public pressure for governments to respond. It can shape perceptions before the facts are clear. So when you see videos circulating, ask, where did this come from? Who verified it? What media organizations are reporting it? Is there corroboration from official sources? This is how responsible analysis works. You distinguish between what's confirmed and what's claimed, and you wait for verification before treating something as fact. Because in an information environment where everyone has a camera and everyone has a platform, the challenge isn't finding information, it's finding truth. What this means moving forward. So where are we? The Venezuela operation has evolved into something more complex than Washington anticipated. It's not just a domestic law enforcement action anymore. It's a naval blockade that's struggling to enforce compliance. It's a diplomatic crisis with Russia. It's a border security challenge for Colombia. It's a regional sovereignty issue uniting Latin American governments. And it's becoming a test case for whether the United States can use economic and military pressure to reshape a country without triggering broader geopolitical consequences. The early evidence suggests no, it cannot. The blockade is leaking. Tankers are escaping. Russia is providing protection. Latin America is pushing back. The UN is expressing concern. And the tools the US is using, sanctions, interdictions, naval patrols, are proving less effective than expected against adversaries who are adapting in real time. This doesn't mean the operation will fail. The U.S. has enormous military and economic power. It can sustain pressure indefinitely. It can seize more ships. It can impose more sanctions. It can escalate. But escalation has costs, and those costs are mounting. Trust with regional partners is eroding. Confrontations with Russia are increasing. The precedent being set that powerful nations can use force to achieve their objectives is one that will be cited by others. China is watching. Every country with resources the U.S. might want is watching. And they're all drawing the same conclusion: reduce dependence on American systems, diversify, hedge. This is the strategic cost that doesn't show up in Pentagon briefings: the erosion of soft power, the incentive for other countries to build alternatives, the transformation of the international system from one based on rules to one based on power. And once that transformation is complete, once everyone accepts that power determines outcomes, the system becomes much less stable because power is contested. Rules can create order. Power creates competition. Closing. The crisis that keeps expanding. The Venezuela crisis was supposed to be contained. A quick operation: remove Maduro, install a cooperative government, stabilize oil flows, move on. But containment failed. The crisis is expanding geographically, diplomatically, and economically. It's now a naval standoff in the North Atlantic, a border crisis in Colombia, a diplomatic fracture across Latin America, a test case for international law, and a demonstration of the limits of American power. The airstrikes are over, but the consequences are just beginning. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And what we're watching now rhymes with past moments when empires overextended, when they assumed their power was sufficient to reshape regions without consent, when they forgot that force can remove governments, but it can't build legitimacy. Venezuela will be remembered, not for the operation itself, but for what it revealed about the changing nature of power, the erosion of international norms, and the willingness of other countries to resist. The tanker chase continues. The blockade struggles. The diplomatic fallout spreads. And somewhere in the North Atlantic, a Russian submarine escorts an oil tanker while U.S. naval assets watch. Both sides committed, both sides calculating, both sides wondering, what happens if this goes wrong? That's where we are. That's the story. Not the one you saw on the news last week. The one unfolding right now, while most people have moved on.